Sewing a two-piece placket for petticoat. There is a variation for the two-piece placket that we saw on sleeve. This variation is preferred for petticoats. Learning the method of making a two-piece placket for petticoat will help you make one. Objective: at the end of this class, you will be able to stitch a variation of two-piece placket on a petticoat. Let us first familiarize with the tools and materials that you would need to stitch a variation of the two-piece placket on a sample piece of fabric. You would need cotton fabrics,
pattern square,
tailor's chalk, pins, shears, a pair of scissors, contrasting threads, iron box, measuring tape, seam ripper, and sewing machine. Now let's watch how to stitch a variation of two-piece placket for petticoat on a sample piece of fabric. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the required sample fabric pieces. Measure and mark 10 inches by 6 inches squares on one double layer of cotton fabric with the help of a tailor's square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. These will be the outer pieces. Use shears to cut the marked area. For the facing piece, draw a 7 inches by 2.5 inches and 7 inches by 1.5 inches square on a single layer of a different color fabric. Please note, we are using a different color fabric for the facing piece for demonstration purposes only, otherwise we would use the same fabric as the outer piece. Use shears to cut the marked area on fabric. Step 2. Mark seam lines on facing and outer fabric pieces. Mark a seam line on the wrong side of both facing pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the long side. Then mark a seam line on wrong side of both outer pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Step 3. Position and pin smaller facing on one sample piece and baste. Take one sample piece and fix smaller facing 7 inches by 1/3 inch on the right hand side with right sides of fabric together along the long right side. Step 4. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Start stitching with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Stitch on the seam line up to 6 inches length, leaving 1 inch unstitched. Lock the stitching at the end with reverse stitches. Remove basting with a seam ripper. Step 5. Fold and iron fabric pieces and stitch. Now fold and iron the raw edges of the opposite side ½ inch inside of the facing. Fold the facing piece inside to the wrong side of the outer piece. Iron the folded piece. Stitch close to the edge up to the length of seam line from the right side of the fabric. Step 6. Position and pin bigger facing on the other sample piece and baste. Take the other sample piece and the bigger facing, 7 inches by 2½ inches, on the right-hand side with right sides of fabric together along the long left side. Pin first, then baste along the seam line. Step 7. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Start stitching with reverse stitches along the seam line. ½ inch from the edge and up to 1 inch before the end of the facing. Lock the stitching at the end with reverse stitch. Remove basting with seam ripper. Step 8. Fold and iron the raw edge to the inside of facing. Now fold and iron the raw edge of the opposite side and the raw edge at the bottom ½ inch to the inside of the facing. Bring the folded edge to the made seam line by folding it to the right side on the outer piece's right side. The folded edge should match the seam. Step 9. Turn it inside out, clip in an angle and stitch. Now turn it inside out, the folded edge matching the seam line. Clip the 1/2-inch seam allowance in an angle. Keep it in place with pins. Stitch 1/2 inch from the edge. Take it out of the sewing machine and turn the corner over. Step 10. Join fabric pieces on the remaining unstitched seam line. Place the 2 sample pieces one over the other with right sides together. The sample with bigger facing has to be on top. Join them on the remaining unstitched seam line. Pin the 2 layers to keep them in place. Step 11. Stitch on the seam line and remove pins. Then stitch with sewing machine on the seam line. At the end of the seam line, turn the sample 90 degrees and join the 2 facings. When finished stitching, cut the threads and remove pins. Step 12. Hem around the folded edges and remove pins. Trim 3/4 inch of the smaller facing piece at the bottom. Open the sample pieces with wrong side up with the bigger facing on top of the smaller facing. To hold it, fix it with pins. Now hem all around the folded edges. Snip the threads with a pair of small scissors and remove the pins. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned. You learned how to stitch a 2-piece placket for petticoat. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the required sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark seam lines on facing and outer fabric pieces. Step 3. Position and pin smaller facing on one sample piece and baste. Step 4. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Step 5. Fold and iron fabric pieces and stitch. Step 6. Position and pin bigger facing on the outer sample piece and baste. Step 7. Stitch along the seam line and remove basting. Step 8. Fold and iron the raw edge to the inside of facing. Step 9. Turn it inside out, clip in an angle and stitch. Step 10. Join fabric pieces on the remaining unstitched seam line. Step 11. Stitch on the seam line and remove pins. Step 12. Hem around the folded edges and remove pins. You have now learned how to stitch a two-piece placket for petticoat. Take our next class to learn how to stitch a two-piece placket for upper garment.